On a frigid December morning in 1917, when the streets of Petrograd lay silent under a blanket of new snow and the world beyond, Russia's borders was still trying to make sense of the Bolshevik seizure of power. Vladimir Lenin, with the ink barely dry on his revolutionary proclamations, signed a short but devastating decree. It was the birth certificate of the Shika, the first Soviet state security organization and institution that would become a central organ in the transformation of the Russian Revolution into a machinery of control, fear, and organized violence. At its helm was Felix Dzerzhinsky, Iron Felix, a man whose reputation for implacable discipline and ideological purity would make his name synonymous with repression. From the imposing Lubyanka building in central Moscow, a structure whose heavy stone facade and echoing corridors would become a physical embodiment of Soviet authority, the Cheka began its work, at first aimed at rooting out counter-revolutionary and saboteurs, but quickly evolving into something far larger, far darker. This bureaucratic move, so mundane in appearance, laid the foundation for what would become one of the largest and most notorious systems of forced labor in history, the Gulag. The term Gulag would come later, an acronym for Glavno, a Pravlini Lagery, or main administration of camps, but the seeds were sown here in the immediate aftermath of revolution. The early years of Bolshevik power were defined by civil war, foreign intervention, famine, and economic collapse, and Lenin, faced with the chaos of a disintegrating empire, saw in forced labor both an economic expedient and a political instrument. "We must cleanse Russia for long," he wrote in 1918, his words carrying the blunt force of revolutionary certainty. That same year, he authorized the creation of the first concentration camps for unreliable elements, a phrase that in practice meant political opponents, suspected counter-revolutionary, kulaks, and any group deemed resistant to Bolshevik authority. In August 1918, in the midst of a kulak uprising in Penza province, Lenin sent a telegraph to local officials that would resonate as a template for Soviet repression. Hang without fail, so that the people see no fewer than 100 known kulaks, rich men, bloodsuckers. Publish their names, take away all their grain. It was an explicit call for exemplary terror, a directive to make punishment visible and public. The earliest camps, set up during the period known as the Red Terror, were crude, decentralized, and often improvised converted warehouses, monasteries, or military barracks repurposed into holding centers. Among them, the Kolmogorye camp near Arkhangelsk became infamous for its grim mortality rates. Hundreds of officers from Admiral Kolchak's defeated White Army were executed there in 1921, their bodies buried in shallow pits in the frozen earth. Unlike the later industrial-scale operations of Stalin's era, these early camps were small in size, but no less brutal in their intent. They functioned as holding pens for those deemed dangerous to the revolution, and as laboratories for methods of control that would later be perfected on a vast scale. By 1923, one particular camp, the Solovki prison camp, emerged as a model. Located in a former monastery on the remote Solovetsky Islands in the White Sea, its isolation made escape virtually impossible, and its converted monk cells became overcrowded dormitories for political prisoners, former Tsarist officials, intellectuals, and anyone unlucky enough to have crossed the shifting boundaries of Soviet orthodoxy. Dmitry Likhachov, who would later become a celebrated cultural historian, remembered how the cold, damp cells held dozens of men in spaces once built for a single ascetic. At Solovki, the authorities began experimenting with the economic potential of forced labor, logging operations in the island's forests, stone quarrying, and construction projects undertaken in the biting Arctic wind. But more insidiously, Solovki was also where camp authorities pioneered the practice of tying food rations to work output, a system designed by Naftali Frenkel, a former prisoner turned camp administrator. The logic was cruelly simple. Meet your work quota, and you received enough calories to barely sustain yourself. Fall short, and your ration was cut, accelerating your physical decline. This was not merely an economic policy. It was a mechanism of control that transformed hunger into a weapon. In the coming years, Frankel's norms would be applied throughout the Gulag, leading to countless deaths as underfed prisoners became too weak to work, thus ensuring their own starvation. The transformation of the Gulag from ad hoc detention sites into a vast industrialized system coincided with the rise of Joseph Stalin. With the launch of the first five-year plan in 1928, the Soviet Union embarked on an unprecedented program of industrialization and infrastructure building, requiring vast quantities of labor in some of the most inhospitable regions of the country. Stalin saw prisoners not only as a convenient labor force, but also as a means of political control. Projects like the White Sea Baltic Canal, a 141-mile waterway carved through rock and swamp with little more than shovels, picks, and wheelbarrows, became symbols of Soviet willpower and propaganda, even as they consumed human lives on an industrial scale. We need the canal, and we need the people who build it to be reformed through labor. Read one official slogan encapsulating the fiction, that this was a system of moral as well as physical reconstruction. In reality, the project was an execution ground in all but name. Over 25,000 prisoners perished during its construction between 1931 and 1933. The writer Maxim Gorky was taken on a carefully staged tour and returned with glowing articles about the transformative power of labor, though other accounts, smuggled out years later, told of emaciated men collapsing by the roadside, their bodies carted away before the next work brigade arrived. By the mid-1930s, the Gulag system had metastasized into a sprawling network of camps stretching from the Arctic Circle to the deserts of Central Asia. Prisoners mined gold in Kolyma, harvested timber in Siberia, built railways through the tundra, and constructed factories in towns that had not existed a decade earlier. In the Kolyma region alone, prisoners extracted over 2,000 tons of gold between 1932 and 1940, wealth that was critical to funding Soviet industrial imports. The NKVD, successor to the Cheka, became not just an instrument of political policing, but an economic empire with production quotas, industrial goals, and a labor force that could be expanded at will through arrests. By 1940, Gulag labor accounted for roughly 15% of all construction in the USSR. The cities that rose from this labor, Norilsk, Magadan, Vorkuta, were industrial centers built on suffering. Their streets and buildings as much monuments to endurance as to Soviet ambition. Yet for all the industrial output, the Gulag was never purely an economic enterprise. It was, above all, a political weapon. Under Article 58 of the Soviet Criminal Code, an elastic provision covering counter-revolutionary activities, careless remark, an association with a suspect, or even a perceived lack of enthusiasm for Soviet policies could lead to a decade in the camps. Historians would later call this a climate of legal nihilism, where the law existed not to protect, but to entrap. The arrests swept up the famous and the anonymous alike. The poet Anna Akhmatova saw her son, Lev Gumilev, sent to the camps for more than a decade. The rocket engineer Sergei Korolev, who would later launch the Soviet space program, spent years in Kolyma after being denounced by colleagues. The historian Roy Medvedev's father vanished after questioning official biology theories. By the eve of World War II, the Gulag was both a tool of state building and a vast machine of human destruction. Its purpose is much about breaking spirits as building canals or extracting gold. And for those inside its frozen perimeter, the line between survival and oblivion grew thinner with each passing day. By the late 1930s, the Gulag had grown into a shadow empire within the Soviet state, governed by its own hierarchies, rules, and brutal logic. Stalin's Great Purge, beginning in 1936, provided the system with a sudden and massive influx of prisoners. Arrests were not simply reactive, they were planned, with quotas handed down to regional NKVD offices. Entire categories of people were targeted in waves. Former party members accused of Trotskyism, engineers blamed for wrecking, intellectuals labeled as bourgeois nationalists, and ordinary citizens caught in the net of denunciations, often the result of petty personal grudges. In Moscow alone, between August and November 1937, over 30,000 people were arrested. Many of them never saw a trial in any recognizable sense of the word, but were processed through Troika's three-person panels that could hear a case in minutes and hand down sentences ranging from years in the camps to immediate execution. Stalin personally signed hundreds of execution lists, some containing hundreds of names at a time, his pencil marks determining life or death. For those spared the bullet, the alternative was often a journey into the Gulag. The geography of the system was as much a weapon as the punishments themselves. Camps were deliberately sited in the most inhospitable parts of the Soviet Union: the frozen wastes of Kolyma, the swampy taiga of Siberia, the wind-scoured tundra of Vorkuta, the mosquito-infested forests of Karelia. The remoteness was strategic. It made escape nearly impossible and reinforced the isolation that broke prisoners' spirits. Transport to these sites was itself a form of punishment. Prisoners were herded into overcrowded, windowless train cars, Stalipins, where they might spend weeks in transit, chained, hungry, and unsure of their destination. From railheads, they were often marched for days through deep snow or along muddy tracks to reach their assigned camps, with guards quick to shoot anyone who lagged behind. In memoir after memoir, survivors recall the shock of arrival, the sight of barbed wire fences, the looming guard towers, the barking of orders in the freezing air. Daily life in the Gulag was built around labor hard, unrelenting, and often pointless. The official ideology claimed that labor re-educates, but in reality, work was a mechanism of exhaustion. Prisoners rose at 4:30 a.m. to the sound of the camp bell or the shouts of guards, stumbling from their bunks into the cold for the morning roll call. In the Arctic camps, roll calls took place in total darkness during the long polar nights, sometimes lasting for hours if the count did not match the official tally. Survivors like Evgenia Ginsburg described standing motionless in blizzards, feeling frost creep up their legs and into their bones. Breakfast was a thin gruel, often little more than hot water, flavored with traces of cabbage or barley, and a piece of bread rationed according to the previous day's work performance. The bread, around 300 grams for those who met quotas, became both sustenance and currency, traded for favors, protection, or bits of clothing. Those who fell short of their quota received smaller rations, setting in motion a vicious spiral. Less food meant less energy, which meant worse work performance, which in turn meant even less food. This was the logic of the system, one that turned hunger into an instrument of control. Work assignments ranged from logging and mining to road and railway construction, each demanding relentless physical exertion in hostile conditions. In the Amphai coal mines of Vorkuta, prisoners trudged 5 kilometers each way through winds, so fierce that ropes were strung between buildings to prevent workers from being blown off course. In the gold mines of Kolyma, permafrost had to be broken with hand tools before ore could be extracted, an exhausting process, made worse by primitive equipment and the constant presence of armed overseers. Prisoners who failed to meet their quotas could be assigned to the weak brigade, a euphemism for those expected to die soon. As former prisoner Joseph Schomer put it, "You went to the weak brigade only once, you never came back." Living conditions offered little relief. Barracks were overcrowded, often with less than 2 square meters per person. and poorly heated, or not heated at all. In winter, frost formed on the inside walls, and at night, prisoners huddled together for warmth. Mattresses, if they existed, were stuffed with straw long since reduced to dust by insects. Lice, bedbugs, and fleas were constant companions, spreading disease through already weakened populations. Medical care was minimal, and illness often meant being sent to the infirmary only when one was too sick to work, by which time survival was unlikely. Guards wielded near-total power over prisoners' lives. Beatings were common, administered for real or imagined infractions, or simply at the whim of a bored overseer. In some camps, guards delegated enforcement to criminal prisoners Urki, operated their own brutal hierarchies, and preyed on political prisoners with impunity. The use of informants was another layer of control. Stukachi could be anyone, and the knowledge that a casual remark might be reported destroyed trust. Among inmates, in Solovki, records show that as many as 1 in 5 prisoners were informers. Even in these conditions, moments of humanity flickered through. Whispered conversations between bunkmates, a stolen page of poetry, the secret carving of a chess set from scraps of wood. But such acts carried risks, and punishment cells, karcers, were always waiting. These unheated isolation boxes could mean slow death in the Siberian winter, with prisoners emerging frostbitten, hallucinating, or not at all. For Stalin, the Gulag was not merely a penal system. It was an instrument of social engineering, a way to reshape Soviet society by physically removing and breaking those deemed undesirable. It was also a tool of colonization. Vast swaths of the Soviet Union's resource-rich but sparsely populated regions were opened up through forced labor. In the Kolyma region, the Dalstroy Agency operated like a colonial government, overseeing not just mining operations, but the administration of entire territories. The Gulag's dual role as both a mechanism of terror and a pillar of economic development was unique in modern history, and by the eve of World War II, it had become entrenched in the fabric of the Soviet state. Yet for those trapped inside its boundaries, the purpose hardly mattered. Whether they were there to build a canal, mine gold, fell timber, or simply vanish from public life, their reality was the same. Endless work, inadequate food, brutal discipline, and the constant calculation of how to survive one more day. And in the years to come, as war engulfed the Soviet Union, even this fragile balance between life and death would tilt further toward the latter, as the Gulag became both a dumping ground for returning prisoners of war and a reservoir of expendable labor for the war effort. When the Second World War erupted in 1939, and the Soviet Union was drawn first into its periphery and then into its brutal center, the Gulag system did not shrink under the pressure of war. It adapted, expanded, and in many ways intensified its function as both a true reservoir of forced labor and a mechanism of political control. The demands of the wartime economy gave new urgency to the use of prisoner labor. Vast projects, from mining to railway construction, were now directly tied to the survival of the Soviet state in the face of Nazi aggression. Camps in resource-rich regions like Vorkuta's coal fields, Norilsk's nickel mines, and Kolyma's gold deposits became critical suppliers for wartime industry. Prisoners, clad in rags and often working in temperatures that plunged to -40 degrees Celsius, extracted the raw materials for tanks, aircraft, munitions, and infrastructure. For those inside the wire, the war changed little in their daily suffering, if anything. It worsened conditions as already meager food rations were cut to support the front, and medical supplies, tools, and even warm clothing were redirected to the Red Army. But the war years brought a new and bitter twist. Returning Soviet prisoners of war, liberated from German camps, often found themselves sent directly into the Gulag upon repatriation. Stalin's Order No 270, and later directives made clear that capture by the enemy was seen not as misfortune, but as treason. There are no prisoners of war, only traitors, Stalin is reputed to have said. Men who had endured years of starvation and abuse in Nazi camps were interrogated by SMERSH, the Soviet counterintelligence agency, and, in countless cases, sentenced under Article 58 for collaboration or anti-Soviet agitation, based on nothing more than their survival behind German lines. Entire trainloads of these repatriated soldiers were transported to camps in Siberia and Kazakhstan. Their uniforms were placed with numbered prison garb, their war medals useless against the suspicion that now clung to them. In Leningrad, a city that had suffered the horrific 900-day siege, some residents who had survived by trading on the black market or who had expressed despair during the famine were arrested after liberation for anti-Soviet statements and deported east. The war also accelerated ethnic deportations on an unprecedented scale. In 1943 and 1944, entire nationalities were accused of collaboration with the enemy and forcibly removed from their homelands. Chechens, English, Crimean Tatars, Volga Germans, and others were rounded up in the dead of night, given minutes to pack, and herded into cattle cars for journeys that lasted weeks. In the case of the Chechens and English, nearly 500,000 people were sent to Central Asia in February 1944. Official records admit that up to a third died en route or in the first harsh winters of exile. The deportations were not just punishment, they were erasure. Villages were razed, place names were changed, cemeteries destroyed. The lands were resettled with others deemed politically reliable, and returning was forbidden for decades. The Gulag's population swelled with these deportees, many of whom lived in special settlements under constant guard, forced into logging, farming, or industrial work far from their native regions. Inside the camps, war production took precedence over everything else. In Magdan, prisoners worked round-the-clock shifts in the mines, the lines between day and night erased under electric floodlights. In Norilsk, smelting operations were pushed beyond safety limits, with prisoners handling molten metal in unventilated buildings. Accidents were frequent and often fatal, but every injury or death was recorded as a statistic, not a tragedy. Camp. Commandants were rewarded not for preserving their workforce, but for meeting or exceeding production quotas, creating an incentive structure in which human lives were expendable. Food remained the central currency of survival, and wartime scarcity deepened the rationing system's cruelty. Those who could not keep up with the pace were sent to punishment brigades, where work was more dangerous and rations smaller. Survival strategies became ever more desperate. Prisoners stole scraps from camp kitchens, chewed leather belts for fiber, or ate anything remotely edible from the taiga lichen, bark, even rodents. And yet, amidst this relentless grind, the human will to resist flickered on. Acts of defiance ranged from small to spectacular, sabotaging machinery, forging tools, hiding fugitives within work details. In 1942, at a camp near Vorkuta, a group of Polish officers, already condemned to years of hard labor, refused in order to work in solidarity with a fellow prisoner accused of sabotage. All were beaten and thrown into the punishment cells, but their refusal became camp legend. More dramatic still was the 1943 Norilsk labor strike, in which thousands of prisoners, enraged by a combination of starvation rations, overwork, and arbitrary executions, refused to work for several days. Although the strike was brutally suppressed, with many shot or sent to even harsher regimes, it demonstrated that even under total control, the Gulag could not entirely extinguish collective action. The war's end did not bring immediate relief. In fact, the immediate post-war years saw some of the highest prisoner populations in Gulag history. peaking at around 2.5 million in 1950, Stalin's paranoia, far from subsiding, turned inward once more. The Leningrad Affair of 1949, in which much of the city's party leadership was purged, sent hundreds more into exile or the camps. The so-called Doctor's Plot of 1952 accused prominent Jewish physicians of conspiring to assassinate Soviet leaders, fueling an anti-Semitic campaign that hinted at a new purge on the eve of Stalin's death. Within the camps, conditions remained lethal. In Kolyma, where winters could last 8 months and temperatures dropped below -50, mortality rates reached as high as 30% in some brigades. Prisoners mined lead, zinc, and uranium without protective equipment, the dust and radiation cutting years off their lives. At the Vorkuta coal mines, explosions and collapses killed dozens in single incidents, their deaths scarcely acknowledged beyond the notation in camp records. The Salikerd-Igarka Railway, known among prisoners as the Dead Road, consumed thousands of lives before being abandoned after Stalin's death, leaving rusting rails stretching into the tundra as a monument to wasted labor and wasted lives. Yet the Gulag was not only an industrial engine, it was a cultural crucible of a grim kind. Writers, poets, scientists, and artists passed through its gates, some managing to create even in captivity. Secret poems were memorized and passed from bunk to bunk. Chess games were carved from bread. Coded messages were tapped through barrack walls. For many, this preservation of mind was as vital as the preservation of body. As former prisoner Varlam Shalamov would later write in his Kolyma tales, the Gulag was not a place where men were re-educated, but where they were unmade, and only those who clung to some inner fragment of self could hope to emerge intact. And yet, survival was no guarantee of freedom. Release often meant -6, exile banishment from the 6 largest cities of the USSR, and any border region or continued surveillance by the MVD. For countless former prisoners, the Gulag was not simply a place they had been. It was a condition that followed them, shaping their speech, their behavior, their sense of what could and could not be said in public. By the time Stalin died in March 1953, the Gulag was deeply embedded in Soviet society, both as a physical network of camps and as an invisible network of fear. The machinery of arrest, deportation, and forced labor had claimed millions of lives, directly and indirectly, and its logic had seeped into every layer of governance. The question of what would happen to this vast prison empire without its architect was one that haunted both the guards and the guarded. The answer, as the next years would show, would be complex, a mixture of dismantling, denial, and the persistence of old habits under new names. When Joseph Stalin died on March 5, 1953, Soviet Union stood at a crossroads, both politically and morally. For decades, Stalin's will had been the gravitational center around which the entire apparatus of repression revolved. Now, with that force suddenly gone, his successors faced the monumental question of whether the Gulag system, by then comprising hundreds of camp complexes and holding over 2 million prisoners, could be maintained, reformed, or dismantled. In the first chaotic weeks after his death, Lavrentiy Beria, the feared head of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, MVD, moved quickly to consolidate power and position himself as the architect of a new course. In an unexpected gesture, Beria announced an amnesty on March 27, 1953, that released more than 1 million prisoners. Yet the majority of those freed were not political prisoners, but those with sentences of less than 5 years, pregnant women, and mothers with young children. For many political prisoner scientists, writers, officers, ordinary citizens caught in the web of Article 58 freedom remained out of reach. Still, this amnesty sent shockwaves through the camp network. In remote regions, guards read out lists of names, For those called, the gates swung open, and the long road home began. For others, the announcement only deepened despair, as they realized they were not among the chosen. The amnesty was less an act of repentance than a practical decision. The Gulag, increasingly inefficient and costly, was straining the Soviet economy, and Beria understood the need to reduce the burden. Yet his political maneuvering would not. Last by June 1953, Beria himself was arrested and executed by his rivals in the Presidium. The real turning point came 3 years later, in February 1956, when Nikita Khrushchev, now firmly in power, stood before a closed session of the 20th Congress of the Communist Party and delivered what would become known as the secret speech. For nearly 4 hours, Khrushchev dismantled the cult of personality that had grown around Stalin, denouncing his grave abuses of power and the mass repressions that had sent millions to their deaths or to the Gulag. The speech was never intended for public release, but its contents spread rapidly through whispers, foreign broadcasts, and smuggled transcripts, igniting hope among families of the repressed. Khrushchev named names. He condemned the fabricated doctor's plot of 1953, acknowledged the executions of old Bolsheviks like Bukharin and Zinoviev during the Great Purge, and decried the use of the term enemy of the people as a tool for physical annihilation. Though careful to frame these crimes as Stalin's personal deviations rather than systemic flaws of the Soviet state, Khrushchev's words cracked open a space for redress. Special commissions were dispatched to review cases, traveling to camps from Mordovia to Magadan, where they pored over files and interviewed inmates. Between 1954 and 1957, more than 500,000 cases were examined, and hundreds of thousands of prisoners were rehabilitated, their sentences annulled, their records wiped clean, or at least officially amended. Yet rehabilitation was a selective process. Those deemed genuine threats, nationalists, religious leaders, outspoken critics of communism, often remained imprisoned or in exile. In Varuda, a coal mining complex above the Arctic Circle, the arrival of a commission in 1956 sparked elation. That quickly turned to bitterness, as many prisoners learned that errors in their cases would not be acknowledged. For others, release was immediate but fraught. Returning home after years or decades inside the Gulag was rarely the joyous reunion imagined in the camps. Many found their apartments occupied by strangers, their possessions long gone. There, jobs filled dot in cities across the USSR. The sudden influx of former prisoners created a quiet crisis. Men and women, marked by the stigma of the Gulag, navigated a society that preferred to look away from what had been done in its name. Some were subjected to -6 restrictions, barring them from living in major cities or border regions. Others were shadowed by the KGB, their conversations monitored, their movements noted. The physical dismantling of the Gulag was gradual. By 1960, most of the large camp complexes had been officially closed. Their functions shifted to the Ministry of Justice and a smaller network of corrective labor colonies. The industrial projects that had depended on prisoner labor railways, canals, mining towns were handed over to civilian workforces, though in many cases these free workers lived in conditions scarcely better than those of the former inmates. Yet the psychological infrastructure of repression proved harder to dismantle. In countless homes, survivors of the camps struggled with nightmares, chronic illness, and an unshakable sense of dislocation. Writers like Alexander Solzhenitsyn, whose One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich was briefly published under Khrushchev's thaw, brought the Gulag's reality into the open, but censorship soon reasserted itself, and many first-hand accounts circulated only in samizdat or abroad. The Soviet state, even as it denounced Stalin's excesses, resisted any reckoning that might implicate the broader system. In Magadan, streets built by prisoners were renamed. but older residents still referred to neighborhoods by their camp designations. On the Solovetsky Islands, the ruins of the first great prison camp stood, largely untouched, their history unmarked. It was not until the late 1980s, under Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika, that a fuller public reckoning began. Archives were partially opened, memoirs were published, and memorial societies sprang up to record testimonies and locate mass graves. The human rights organization Memorial, founded in 1989, became the central repository for these efforts, documenting the names of the repressed and erecting monuments like the Solovetsky Stone in Moscow's Lubyanka Square massive boulder, brought from the islands and placed before the former headquarters of the KGB. Across the former Soviet space, physical memorials appeared, the Mask of Sorrow in Magadan, depicting faces twisted in grief, plaques in small towns listing the deported and executed, and in 2017, the Wall of Grief in Moscow, Russia's first national monument to the victims of political repression. Yet this reckoning was incomplete and fragile. In the 21st century, under Vladimir Putin, the state's relationship with the Gulag's memory shifted again. While some official commemorations continued, there was a renewed emphasis on national pride and the Soviet Union's achievements, often at the expense of confronting its darkest chapters. In 2021, Memorial itself was forcibly dissolved by court order, accused of being a foreign agent, a move widely seen as an attempt to curtail independent historical inquiry. Historians like Yuri Dmitriev, who had discovered mass graves from the Great Terror, faced prosecution on controversial charges. The state fears memory, Memorial's late chairman Arseny Roginsky observed, because memory is the foundation of responsibility. Today, the physical remnants of the Gulag are vanishing wooden barracks collapsing under Arctic snows, rusting watchtowers reclaimed by forests, the barbed wire swallowed by moss. The human witnesses, too, are fading, their voices preserved, only in recordings, books, and fading photographs. As the last survivors pass away, the danger grows that the Gulag will be reduced to an abstraction, stripped of its human detail. But those who lived through it, like Varlam Shalamov, warned against both forgetting and romanticizing. The camps, he wrote after 17 years in Kolyma, were not built for correction. They were built for destruction. Eugenia Ginsburg, who returned to Moscow, like a ghost walking streets where I had once been alive, insisted that to speak of the Gulag was to resist its final goal, erasure. And so the responsibility falls to those who inherit these stories, to ensure that the silence of the taiga does not bury the voices of the millions who walked its frozen corridors. The Gulag, dismantled in bricks and barbed wire, endures as a moral fact, a warning etched in history's coldest stone, that a state which claims the right to erase its enemies may, in time, erase the truth itself. After Khrushchev's thaw began to fade in the early 1960s, the Soviet Union entered a long period of stagnation under Leonid Brezhnev, during which the official narrative of the Gulag became more selective and constrained. The state continued to acknowledge the excesses of Stalin's rule, but it carefully framed these as isolated deviations from the otherwise just course of socialism, never as a systemic flaw. Rehabilitation commissions still processed some cases, and memoirs like Alexander Solzhenitsyn's One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich were briefly permitted, but the window of openness narrowed quickly. By 1964, works that touched too directly on the scale or cruelty of the Gulag were suppressed, their authors harassed or exiled. The political use of imprisonment also evolved. While the mass arrests of the 1930s and 1940s never returned, dissidents, human rights activists, nationalist intellectuals, and religious believers increasingly found themselves confined to corrective labor colonies or psychiatric hospitals, the latter a particularly insidious form of repression. in which political dissent was rebranded as mental illness. In Mordovia and Perm, political colonies became centers for holding those who dared to challenge the system, their inmates a small but symbolically potent reminder that the machinery of punishment still existed. The very term Gulag fell out of official use, replaced with bureaucratic euphemisms. But the logic of isolation, forced labor, and control persisted. Inside the USSR, public discussion of the camp system receded into whispers, kept alive only in private kitchens, among trusted friends, or in the coded language of literature. Abroad, however, the Gulag became a central symbol in the ideological struggle of the Cold War. Western journalists, defectors, and emigre writers documented the testimonies of survivors, while samizdat networks risked arrest to circulate forbidden manuscripts. The publication in 1973 of Solzhenitsyn's monumental The Gulag Archipelago in Paris shattered any remaining illusions in the West about the nature of Soviet repression, weaving together hundreds of prisoner accounts into a literary and moral indictment of the system. The Soviet state responded with fury, expelling Solzhenitsyn in 1974 and intensifying censorship, but the damage to its international image was irreversible. Inside the Soviet Union, the book's very title entered the lexicon of dissent, whispered as shorthand for a shared, unspoken knowledge of what lay beneath the veneer of official history. As the Brezhnev era wore on, the passing of time began to erode the immediacy of the Gulag in the public mind. Younger generations born after Stalin's death grew up with only fragmentary knowledge, and aging relatives' cryptic remark, a sudden change of subject when certain years were mentioned. The camps themselves, many now abandoned, fell into disrepair, their guard towers leaning, their fences rusting away under snow and rain. Some were repurposed for civilian use. Others vanished entirely, reclaimed by forest and tundra. Yet beneath the surface, the unresolved legacy of the Gulag lingered. It would take the political upheavals of the late 1980s to bring it back into the open. Under Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, the Soviet state finally loosened its grip on historical memory. Archival restrictions were partially lifted, and newspapers began publishing investigative articles about the purges, the deportations, and the camp system. Survivors who had lived in silence for decades began to speak publicly, their memoirs serialized in popular journals. Organizations like Memorial, founded in 1989, became the custodians of this fragile recovery of truth, compiling lists of the repressed, locating mass graves, and erecting memorials. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that the Soviet Union would fully confront its own history. The collapse of the USSR in 1991 opened the archives further, and researchers uncovered documents with Stalin's personal signatures authorizing mass executions, as well as internal NKVD reports on camp mortality that confirmed survivor testimonies. In the Solovetsky Islands, one of the original and most notorious campsites, a monument was erected bearing a stark inscription to the victims of repression. In Moscow, the Solovetsky Stone, a massive boulder from the islands, was placed in Lubyanka Square, directly opposite the former KGB headquarters, as a permanent challenge to official amnesia. Throughout Russia and the newly independent states, local memorials appeared, plaques in villages marking deportations, museums in former camp buildings, and public ceremonies honoring those lost. The 1990s were also a time of reckoning in literature and film, as the Gulag entered school curricula and television documentaries. Yet this openness proved to be as fragile as it was unprecedented. By the early 2000s, under Vladimir Putin, the tone began to shift. While the state continued to acknowledge the Gulag as a historical fact, it emphasized the resilience of the Soviet people and the achievements of industrialization, framing the repression as a tragic but necessary cost of national greatness. The narrative was reframed to fit a politics of restored national pride, and independent historical research came under increasing pressure. Memorial, which had by then become the largest and most respected human rights organization in Russia, faced harassment, legal challenges, and finally, in 2021, a court-ordered dissolution under the Foreign Agent Law. The state's reluctance to engage fully with the Gulag's legacy was not only about controlling the past, it was also about controlling the present, about limiting the use of historical memory as a tool for critiquing contemporary power. In this atmosphere, the physical remnants of the Gulag decaying barracks in Kolyma, the skeletal guard towers of Vorkuta, the weed-covered rail lines of the dead road stand as mute witnesses. Some have been preserved by local historians, or turned into small museums. Others have simply been left to collapse into the earth. For the dwindling number of survivors still alive, the urgency of remembrance is sharper than ever. They know that when the last voices fall silent, the struggle over memory will intensify, and the danger of the Gulag becoming an abstraction will grow. In their testimonies, they often echo the same warning. The Gulag was not an aberration of the past, but a reminder of what can happen whenever fear and power converge unchecked. As one former prisoner told a gathering in Magadan in 2015, standing before the Mask of Sorrow monument, the camps will never truly be gone. They are a shadow we must watch for all our lives. In that sense, the Gulag remains both history and prophecy, a chapter closed in fact, but open in meaning, a testament not only to the cruelty of a system, but to the endurance of those who, against all odds, carried its memory through the years of silence. In the 21st century, the Gulag's shadow stretches across both Russian society and the world's historical conscience, shaping debates about state power, human rights, and the politics of memory. Within Russia, the official approach to the Gulag's legacy has become a balancing act, acknowledge enough to appear historically responsible, but not so much that the narrative undermines state authority or national pride. School textbooks now often devote only a few paragraphs to the Gulag, presenting it as one element among many in the Soviet Union's rapid modernization, and sometimes framing it as a harsh but necessary measure in a dangerous era. Public memorial events are allowed but tightly controlled. Independent initiatives that link past repression to present political practices are treated with suspicion, and often with outright hostility. The dissolution of Memorial in 2021 was more than an administrative act, it was a symbolic reassertion of state dominance over the narrative of history, signaling that certain truths, however well documented, are considered politically inconvenient. The current official discourse tends to emphasize the heroism of the Soviet people during industrialization and the Second World War, while framing the Gulag as a regrettable but exaggerated phenomenon, sometimes even suggesting that Western historians have magnified its scale for ideological reasons. This reframing has had tangible effects. Younger Russians, especially those born after the collapse of the USSR, are often less familiar with the details of the camp system than their parents or grandparents. Polls have shown a growing number of respondents unable to identify what the Gulag was, or believing it was a minor episode. In this context, the physical remnants of the Gulag decaying camp barracks in Kolyma, the corroded rails of the dead road, the overgrown perimeters of former labor colonies take on an urgent symbolic weight. Local activists and historians, often working with minimal resources, have tried to preserve these sites as open-air museums, gathering oral histories from surviving former prisoners, cataloging artifacts, and marking unmarked graves. In some cases, they have succeeded in creating places of public education. In others, they have faced bureaucratic resistance, lack of funding, or even harassment from authorities. Internationally, the Gulag remains a potent symbol of totalitarian Repression, often invoked alongside the Nazi concentration camps in discussions of the 20th century's darkest crimes. Academic conferences, museum exhibits, and documentary films continue to explore its history, drawing on the vast archive of survivor testimonies, declassified documents, and material remains. In countries with significant diasporas from former Soviet republics, such as Canada, the United States, and Germany, memorials to the victims of communism prominently feature the Gulag as a core reference point. UNESCO has recognized certain Gulag-related sites as part of the world's cultural heritage, acknowledging their universal significance as warnings against authoritarian abuse. Yet even in the global arena, the politics of memory can be contentious. In international forums, Russian officials sometimes push back against language that explicitly equates Soviet repression with Nazi atrocities, arguing that the two systems were fundamentally different in intent and scope. This debate reflects a broader struggle over the interpretation of history itself, a struggle in which the Gulag's legacy is a contested resource. Meanwhile, the lived memory of the Gulag is vanishing as the last survivors pass away. Oral history. Projects race against time to record their stories, capturing details that cannot be found in documents. The texture of prison uniforms, the sound of boots on frozen ground, the coded gestures used to communicate without words. These personal accounts, often filled with small, humanizing moments, sharing a crust of bread, carving a chess set from wood scraps, whispering lines of Forbidden's poetry stand as a counterpoint to the cold statistics of archival reports. They remind us that the Gulag was not just an abstract system, but millions of individual lives, each with its own arc of hope, endurance, and loss. The global historical community faces its own challenge: how to keep this memory alive for generations, with no direct connection to the events. Museums from Warsaw to Washington, from Berlin to Bishkek, have experimented with immersive exhibits, using digital reconstructions to place visitors inside a barracks or on a worksite, while educational programs integrate survivor memoirs into classroom curricula. Yet the effectiveness of these efforts depends on political will, and in some places, competing narratives threaten to dilute or distort the historical record. The stakes of this memory work are not purely academic. Around the world, human rights advocates point to the Gulag as a reminder of how quickly systems of arbitrary detention, forced labor, and dehumanization can emerge when states operate without checks and balances. In Russia itself, the invocation of the Gulag in contemporary political discourse can be risky, but it persists in underground art, in dissident literature, and in the guarded conversations of those who see parallels between past and present. The power of the Gulag as a symbol lies in its duality. It is at once a specific historical phenomenon, tied to a particular time and place, and a broader warning about the capacity of political systems to rationalize cruelty in the name of higher goals. As the 21st century advances, the question remains whether the Gulag will be remembered as a central lesson of the Soviet experience, or relegated to a footnote in the story of Russian power. The answer will depend not only on historians and educators, but on the choices of ordinary citizens, whether they choose to look at the crumbling watchtowers and rusting barbed wire and see them as relics of a distant past or as mirrors held up to the present. In that choice lies the future of the Gulag's legacy, and perhaps the future of historical truth itself. In the decades since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Gulag has moved beyond the borders of Russia and the former USSR to become a subject of global historical research, cultural representation, and moral reflection. Universities, museums, and research institutes across Europe, North America, and Asia have devoted substantial resources to studying the camp system in its full complexity, not merely as a story of political repression, but as a social, economic, and cultural phenomenon. Scholars have examined the Gulag's role in Soviet industrialization, its impact on the environment through massive resource extraction, and its function as a tool of demographic engineering through forced resettlement and ethnic deportations. One major area of focus has been comparative analysis, how the Gulag relates to other systems of mass detention and forced labor in the 20th century, from Nazi concentration camps to Mao's Laogai in China and Cambodia's re-education camps. Under the Khmer Rouge, while acknowledging profound differences in ideology, scale, and method, researchers have also identified common patterns: political paranoia, the dehumanization of prisoners, the use of labor as both punishment and economic resource, and the creation of bureaucratic structures that routinized cruelty. Alongside academic work, the Gulag has found a place in global cultural memory. Works of literature, such as Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago, Varlam Shalamov's Kolyma Tales, and Evgenia Ginsberg's Journey into the Whirlwind, remain central texts in understanding the lived experience of the camps. These writings have been translated into dozens of languages, their stark prose and moral urgency resonating far beyond the Russian-speaking world. They are studied not only in history courses, but in literature, political science, and ethics, serving as enduring reminders that the struggle against repression is both political and deeply personal. In visual art, former prisoners' sketches, paintings, and carvings often created in secret and smuggled out offer a raw, immediate perspective, capturing moments of camp life that no official photograph would record. A guard's shadow. Across the snow, the huddle of prisoners around a thin fire, the silent exchange of bread. Exhibitions of these works in cities from Moscow to New York, from Berlin to Tokyo, have brought the Gulag's reality into spaces where viewers can confront it viscerally, often alongside survivor testimonies played in their own voices. Film has also been a powerful medium for conveying the Gulag's history. Documentaries such as Gulag, produced by the BBC and PBS, and feature films like Within the Whirlwind and the Cold, Summer of 1953, dramatize personal stories within the larger historical framework. In recent years, virtual reality technology has even been used to reconstruct camp environments, allowing visitors to walk through barracks, along barbed wire fences, and into the punishment cells, guided by narrations from survivors. Yet, cultural representation comes with its own challenges. In some portrayals, the Gulag risks becoming an exoticized or depoliticized setting, stripped of its historical specificity and used as a generic backdrop for tales of endurance. This tension is particularly evident in popular culture, where references to the Gulag sometimes surface in casual or metaphorical ways that dilute its gravity. Historians and educators stress the importance of grounding any representation in accurate historical context, not only to honor the experiences of those who endured it, but to preserve the Gulag as a meaningful symbol against political repression. Global memorial projects have sought to create spaces where the memory of the Gulag is preserved collectively. In Canada, the Tribute to Liberty Monument in Ottawa, dedicated to the victims of communism, includes explicit reference to the Gulag. In Germany, the Berlin Hohenschönhausen Memorial, while focused on the Stasi Prisonhost's exhibitions on Soviet repression, creating links between different histories of state control. In Kazakhstan, the Alzir Memorial near Astana commemorates women imprisoned as wives of traitors to the motherland, a category unique to the Soviet system. These sites often serve as platforms for survivor testimonies, educational programs, and cross-national dialogues about memory and justice. The Gulag's environmental legacy has also entered the global research agenda. In regions like Kolyma and Norilsk, the scars of forced labor remain etched into the landscape. Abandoned mines, polluted rivers, and ghost towns were only the skeletal. Remains of guard towers and rail lines testify to the human cost of extraction. Climate change is now revealing some of these sites in new ways. As melting permafrost exposes mass graves and camp infrastructure long frozen in time, offering archaeologists a grim but valuable opportunity to study the material culture of repression. On the international stage, the Gulag has become part of broader conversations about human rights and transitional justice. In post-conflict societies, from South Africa to Rwanda, truth commissions have looked to the Soviet example, both the suppression of memory under authoritarian rule and the partial, contested process of reckoning that followed, as a case study in the difficulties of national reconciliation. The Gulag serves as a cautionary tale about the limits of reform when the underlying structures of power remain intact. In Russia itself, the cultural battle over the Gulag's memory continues, while independent filmmakers, writers, and artists still produce work that confronts the legacy head-on. Official channels often favor narratives that minimize or contextualize the repression as a necessary phase in the Soviet Union's development. Public opinion is divided, with some seeing the Gulag primarily as a historical crime, others as a closed chapter best left in the past, and still others as a distorted Western narrative. This contested memory underscores the Gulag's enduring power not just as history, but as a mirror in which societies see what they choose to see about themselves. The global research community, aware of these tensions, has increasingly emphasized collaboration with local historians and community groups in former Gulag regions, recognizing that the most authentic and sustainable preservation of memory comes from those who live alongside its traces. The future of the Gulag's legacy will depend on such partnerships, on the willingness to listen to the stories that have survived, and on the commitment to keep them alive in classrooms, museums, and public discourse. For as long as those stories are told, whether in the pages of a memoir, in the lines of a poem, in the grainy photograph of a prisoner's face, the Gulag will remain more than a relic of the past. It will be a living warning, a shared inheritance, and a test of our capacity to remember not just the suffering, but the choices that made it possible. Beyond official archives, historical studies, and public monuments, perhaps the most haunting and enduring legacy of the Gulag survives in the deeply personal writings of those who lived through it. Poems scribbled on scraps of paper, letters smuggled out of camps in false-bottomed suitcases, coded messages scratched onto wood or cloth, and the half-spoken words passed from one prisoner to another in the darkness of a barracks. These fragments, often created under the most perilous conditions, carry an emotional charge that no official document can replicate. In the cramped bunks of Kolyma, Varlang Shalamov composed lines in his head, memorizing them by the rhythm of his own heartbeat, knowing that to commit them to paper too soon was to risk their destruction by a guard's hand. His eventual Kolyma, tales, written years after his release, retain the cadence of those silent recitations, each sentence weighted with the knowledge of survival, bought at unbearable cost. Anna Akhmatova, though not imprisoned herself, became the voice of those waiting outside the prison gates, her cycle requiem capturing the cold and endless hours of standing in lines, the exchange of whispered news, the knowledge that the fate of loved ones lay beyond reach. Evgenia Ginsberg's journey into the whirlwind, and within the whirlwind read, at times like letters to an unseen friend, each page infused with the tension between despair and the stubborn will to bear witness. Many prisoners turn to poetry, not only as an act of self-expression, but as a method of mental preservation. Verses, once committed to memory, could be shared, reshaped, and carried beyond the walls without leaving physical evidence. Some poems were hidden in the seams of clothing or in the bindings of books, retrieved only decades later when their authors were long gone. Letters from the camps were censored, every word read by an official eye, yet prisoners developed a coded language that could pass unnoticed references to weather, the state of a garden, or the condition of a friend might conceal the truth of starvation, forced labor, or the death of a comrade. Families learned to read between the lines, to understand that I am keeping warm meant enduring cold without proper clothing, or that I am working steadily signaled unrelenting quotas in dangerous conditions. Sometimes the very absence of certain phrases was the loudest signal that something was wrong. In the women's camps, embroidery became another form of secret writing. Flowers stitched onto handkerchiefs might conceal dates or initials, each stitch a thread of memory connecting the prisoner to the outside world. These acts of quiet defiance were rarely grand gestures, but they were lifelines. In Mordovia, prisoners passed on the text of forbidden poems by tapping them out in Morse code through the walls, each tap a small assertion of connection in a place designed to sever all bonds. The emotional range of these personal artifacts is as wide as the Gulag system itself. There is grief and rage, but also moments of tenderness, humor, and resilience. A joke told in the cold shared bread during a night shift, the sight of sunlight through the cracks in a wall. These details, preserved in diaries and memoirs, remind us that life in the camps was not only about suffering, but about the stubborn human impulse to find meaning and beauty, even in degradation. Some of these writings were only discovered after the collapse of the Soviet Union, hidden in attics, trunks, or buried beneath floorboards for decades. Their survival is a testament to the courage of those who preserved them, often at great personal risk. For historians, these personal records are invaluable. For descendants, they are sacred heirlooms. They collapse the distance between past and present, transforming the Gulag from an abstract historical phenomenon into a network of intimate human stories. And they challenge us to see the people behind the numbers, not as faceless victims, but as individuals whose inner lives remained rich and complex, even in the face of relentless dehumanization. In a world where authoritarian regimes still seek to control language, to dictate the boundaries of memory, the Gulag's poetry, letters, and secret communications remain urgent reminders of the power of the written word to resist, to endure, and to carry truth across time. They are proof that even in a system designed to erase identity, the act of self-expression can be a form of survival, and that survival itself can be an act of quiet rebellion. The Gulag's legacy did not end at the camp gates, nor even with the deaths of those who had endured it. It seeped into the lives of their families, shaping identities, relationships, and memories across generations. For every prisoner who entered the system, there were wives, husbands, children, parents, and siblings left behind living in a suspended state between hope and despair, often for years without word. The Soviet policy of collective responsibility meant that family members could themselves be punished. Spouses labeled as wives of traitors to the motherland were sent to special camps like Alzir in Kazakhstan, where thousands of women lived under the double burden of exile and stigma. Children were taken from their parents, placed in state orphanages or foster homes, often told that their mothers or fathers were enemies of the people and forbidden to speak of them. This deliberate severing of familial bonds was not only a form of psychological punishment, it was a method of control, erasing names, altering documents, and ensuring that the next generation grew up under a cloud of silence. Yet within families, the truth survived in fragments. In small apartments and village houses, stories were whispered late at night. Photographs were hidden in books and personal belongings. A pocket watch, a shawl, a handwritten letter became talismans of connection to absent loved ones. These objects carried an emotional weight far beyond their material value, serving as proof of existence in the face of official erasure. After release, former prisoners often returned to a world that had moved on without them. Their children, now grown, might not recognize them. Neighbors avoided them for fear of guilt by association. Work and housing were hard to obtain. Many survivors, wary of further persecution, maintained the same silence the state had imposed, speaking only in carefully coded ways, even to their own families. It was often the grandchildren, the post-Stalin generations, who began to ask questions in earnest during the late 1980s and 1990s, as glasnost and the opening of archives allowed a fuller picture to emerge. For these younger generations, the Gulag was both a personal inheritance and a national history lesson, and they sought to reconcile the two. Oral history projects became vital tools in this process, as families recorded the memories of elders before they were lost. In many cases, these intergenerational conversations were the first time such stories had ever been told aloud. The emotional impact was profound. Children learned of the resilience, sacrifices, and moral choices of their parents and grandparents. Survivors felt, perhaps for the first time, that their suffering had meaning in the telling. Across the former Soviet space, family associations formed, uniting descendants of Gulag prisoners in acts of remembrance and advocacy. They lobbied for memorials, organized exhibitions of family archives, and worked to add names to official lists of the repressed. In Ukraine, Latvia, Lithuania, and Kazakhstan, where entire communities had been deported, these groups became central to national efforts at historical reckoning. In Russia, their work was more contested, navigating between grassroots commemoration and state narratives that preferred a sanitized past. The transmission of Gulag memory within families has also been deeply influenced by culture. In some households, the stories have become moral touchstones, shaping values of justice, empathy, and vigilance against tyranny. In others, the trauma has been passed down in more ambiguous ways through a mistrust of authority, an instinct for caution in speech, or an unspoken sense of living with a shadow over one's name. Psychologists studying the descendants of Gulag survivors have noted patterns similar to those seen in other contexts of mass trauma. The persistence of anxiety, a heightened awareness of political danger, and paradoxically, a strong capacity for endurance under hardship. These inherited traits speak to the complex ways in which trauma can be both a wound and a source of strength. Today, as the political climate in Russia once again grows more restrictive, families face renewed challenges in preserving and sharing these memories. Public commemorations may be allowed 1 year and curtailed the next. Archives that were opened in the 1990s have been reclassified or made harder to access. Yet in kitchens and living rooms, in personal blogs and private social media groups, the work of remembrance continues. Children and grandchildren digitize letters and photographs, publish memoirs, and attend online lectures hosted by historians. Every act of sharing becomes a small resistance against the forces of forgetting. In this way, the Gulag remains not just a historical fact, but a living inheritance, an ongoing conversation between generations about truth, justice, and the responsibility to speak. And as long as these family stories are told, they form a counter-archive to the official record, one that resists erasure, preserves the human face of history, and insists that the Gulag's victims are remembered not as numbers, but as mothers and fathers, sons and daughters, whose lives were intertwined with those who loved them, and who carry their memory forward into an uncertain future. The way the Gulag is taught or avoided in classrooms across Russia and the former Soviet republics is one of the clearest indicators of how politics shapes historical memory. In the immediate post-Soviet 1990s, as archives opened and survivors' memoirs flooded the market, there was a brief period when the Gulag became an explicit part of the official school curriculum. History textbooks described it in stark detail. The mass arrests, the forced labor, the staggering death toll. Teachers invited survivors to speak to students, and projects encouraged young people to interview their grandparents about family histories. Museums and memorial sites partnered with schools to create field trips where students could see preserved barracks, guard towers, and personal artifacts. But as the 2000s progressed and political priorities shifted toward fostering national pride and social cohesion, the tone of official education began to change. In modern Russian high school history textbooks approved by the Ministry of Education, the Gulag is often condensed to a few paragraphs, placed alongside industrial achievements of the five-year plans or military victories in the Second World War. The narrative tends to frame the repression as excesses of the Stalin era, sometimes suggesting they were necessary for rapid modernization and often downplaying the number of victims. In some cases, casualty figures are presented with a wide range, leaving room for interpretation that minimizes the scale. Teachers who wish to delve deeper into the topic sometimes face subtle discouragement warnings about over-politicizing lessons, pressure to balance the negative with positive achievements, or reminders to adhere strictly to the textbook. Outside Russia, the picture varies widely. In the Baltic states, Ukraine, and parts of Central Asia, the Gulag is taught as a central pillar of Soviet occupation and repression, with local deportations and camp experiences placed at the heart of national history. School curricula there often include survivor memoirs from local authors, visits to deportation museums, and participation in memorial days. In Latvia, for example, students annually commemorate the June deportations of 1941 and 1949, when thousands of families were sent to Siberia. In Kazakhstan, the Alzir Memorial and Museum is integrated into lessons on political repression, especially for its focus on women and children imprisoned as family members of traitors. In Western countries, the Gulag is usually covered within broader 20th century history courses, often paired with studies of the Nazi Holocaust in comparative genocide and repression units. While this approach helps students understand patterns of state violence across different regimes, it sometimes risks flattening the specific context of Soviet history, especially if classroom time is limited. In academic settings, university, courses on Soviet history, political science, and human rights often use the Gulag as a case study in authoritarian governance, forced labor economies, and the politics of historical memory. In Russia, some universities still run elective courses that include in-depth study of the Gulag, often led by historians working closely with NGOs like Memorial before its closure. These courses examine primary sources from camp archives, survivor testimonies, and the literature of former prisoners. However, such offerings are not widespread, and in recent years, political pressures have led some institutions to scale back or reframe this content. The way young people engage with the Gulag today is also shaped by digital media. Independent online projects, YouTube channels, and social media accounts run by historians or activists offer alternative narratives, posting archival documents, maps of camp locations, and oral histories. These platforms reach audiences that formal education may not, allowing students to explore the topic outside the constraints of the classroom. Yet access to such resources can be uneven. Urban students may easily find them, while those in remote areas remain dependent on whatever version of history their local schools provide. The battle over how the Gulag is taught is, at its core, a battle over what kind of future a society imagines for itself. A curriculum that minimizes or excuses mass repression risks normalizing the idea that the ends justify the means, while one that confronts the full scope of state violence can foster a culture of vigilance and accountability. For many educators committed to historical truth, the challenge is to navigate between official guidelines and the moral imperative to tell the story honestly. Some find creative ways to do this, assigning officially approved texts alongside literature, like One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, encouraging students to interview family members about the past or using art and film as discussion tools. In this way, the Gulag continues to live not just in archives and memorials, but in the conversations between teachers and students, between generations, and between the official narrative and the lived memory that refuses to be erased. Whether the next generation inherits a clear-eyed understanding of this history or a blurred and politicized version will depend as much on the courage of individual educators as on the policies of the state. Artistic expression has always been one of the most enduring channels for preserving and transmitting the memory of the Gulag, often operating in spaces where direct historical discourse was suppressed or censored. In the Soviet era, official state art was bound by the rules of socialist realism, a style that celebrated industrial progress, collective labor, and the supposed moral transformation of society under communism. Within that framework, depictions of the Gulag as sites of suffering were impossible. Yet artists, both prisoners and those outside, found ways to encode their experiences in symbolic language. Painters who had survived the camps sometimes depicted bleak, windswept landscapes with solitary figures dwarfed by vast expanses of snow or taiga, their anonymity a protective veil that nonetheless conveyed isolation and endurance. In exile, others turned to more direct representation. Sketches made in camp, smuggled out at great risk, captured the huddled forms of prisoners, the menacing silhouettes of watchtowers, and the routine of forced labor. The visual arts became a clandestine archive of human resilience, built stroke by stroke in defiance of a system that sought to erase individual suffering. Music, too, carried the Gulag's voice into spaces of shared memory. Within the camps, prisoners composed and sang songs that blended folk melodies with new lyrics about camp life, often cloaked in irony or double meanings to evade punishment. These songs circulated orally, passed from one prisoner transport to another, and after release, some found their way into the broader folk repertoire. Outside the camps, composers in the post-Stalin era sometimes wove subtle allusions to repression into symphonic works or operas, using dissonance, unresolved harmonies, or abrupt shifts in tone to suggest the fracture of human lives under state. Violence. For those who understood the context, these musical gestures spoke volumes without a single explicit word. In the theater, the challenge was even greater. Playwrights seeking to address themes of repression often set their stories in historical or foreign contexts, using allegory to create safe distance. A drama ostensibly about political prisoners in Tsarist Russia or an occupied country might carry unmistakable echoes of the Gulag, allowing audiences to engage with the topic obliquely. In underground or dissident theater, more direct representations were attempted, staged in small apartments or community spaces away from official scrutiny. In the post-Soviet years, some directors brought these works to public stages, blending documentary theater with survivor testimony, archival photographs, and reenactments to create immersive experiences. Film, perhaps the most accessible medium, has played a central role in shaping public perception of the Gulag. Soviet cinema during the Stalin years never acknowledged the camps, but after his death, films began to appear that cautiously approached the subject. The 1962 release of One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, based on Alexander Solzhenitsyn's novella, was a watershed moment, offering Soviet audiences their first sanctioned cinematic glimpse into camp life. Though limited in scope and stripped of political commentary, it opened a door. In later decades, especially after 1991, filmmakers embraced more explicit portrayals. Documentaries like Gulag, BBC, PBS pieced together archival footage with survivor interviews. Dramas like The Cold Summer of 1953 depicted the chaos in remote settlements after the amnesties. Within the Whirlwind, based on Ginsberg's memoir, brought international attention to a personal journey through arrest, exile, and survival. Visual. Storytelling also expanded into experimental forms, with some films combining animation, archival sound, and poetic narration to evoke the psychological landscape of imprisonment. Beyond traditional media, memorial art installations have emerged as powerful tools of commemoration. In Magadan, the mask of sorrow looms over the city, its weeping eyes formed from the silhouettes of prisoners. In Moscow, the Wall of Grief incorporates abstract forms that invite personal interpretation, allowing each viewer to project their own emotional response. Smaller-scale projects like sculptures carved from salvaged, camp wood, or murals painted on the ruins of barracks transform remnants of the Gulag into living art. These works often bypass official narratives, speaking directly to the emotions and imaginations of those who encounter them. Across all these mediums, a common thread runs: the need to speak without permission, to remember without state sanction, and to create spaces physical, emotional, and imaginative where the human truth of the Gulag can survive. In times and places where open discussion is curtailed, art has served as the hidden ledger of history, recording what could not be published, archived, or taught openly. And in the present, as political winds shift and historical memory is contested, once again, these artistic legacies stand as both testimony and warning. They remind us that even when words are forbidden, images, sounds, and performances can carry the weight of truth across decades, resisting erasure and keeping alive the stories of those whom the Gulag sought to silence. In the digital age, preservation and transmission of Gulag memory has entered a new phase, one that transcends physical boundaries and opens unprecedented possibilities for access, engagement, and education. Where once survivor memoirs and archival documents were accessible only in libraries or specialized collections, today vast repositories of material are available at the click of a button. Organizations such as Memorial, before its forced closure, in Russia had already begun digitizing thousands of camp records, deportation lists, personal letters, and photographs, creating searchable databases where descendants could trace the fate of relatives long lost to the system. Even after Memorial's dissolution, parts of its archive have been mirrored and preserved abroad, hosted by international institutions to ensure continued access. University research centers in Europe and North America collaborate with former Soviet historians to scan and annotate NKVD documents, interrogations, and camp registers, making them available in multiple languages. These digital archives not only democratize access to historical sources, but also allow patterns to emerge on a scale previously impossible, mapping the vast geography of the Gulag, cross-referencing names across different regions, and revealing the logistical machinery of repression. Interactive mapping projects have been particularly transformative. Online platforms now offer detailed, zoomable maps plotting every known Gulag site, from the massive complexes of Vorkuta and Kolyma to the smallest special settlements deep in the taiga. Clicking on a location brings up archival photos, survivor testimonies, and related documents, turning abstract geography into a network of human stories. For students and researchers alike, these maps make visible the sheer scope of the system and its reach into nearly every corner of the Soviet Union. Virtual reality, VR, and augmented reality, AR, technologies have added another dimension to this work, creating immersive reconstructions of camp environments. Visitors to certain museums can don a headset and walk through a reconstructed barracks, stand in a guard tower overlooking a frozen perimeter, or experience a simulated worksite at a mine or logging camp. These VR experiences, often based on meticulous historical research and survivor descriptions, are not meant to trivialize the suffering, but to bridge the empathy gap for audiences who have never encountered such conditions. Some projects even integrate audio recordings of survivor voices, recounting daily routines, moments of fear, and flashes of hope, synchronized to the visual environment. Social media has also become a contested but powerful arena for Gulag remembrance. On platforms like YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok, independent historians, educators, and descendants share short videos explaining historical facts, debunking myths, and reading excerpts from memoirs. These bite-sized narratives can reach millions, especially younger audiences who may never pick up a 600-page historical study but will engage with a 3-minute video. Hashtag campaigns such as annual online commemorations tied to Memorial Days encourage users to share family stories, photographs, or readings of Gulag-related literature, creating a crowdsourced archive of remembrance. Digital storytelling. Projects often blend media, pairing satellite images of abandoned campsites with archival photos taken decades earlier, or juxtaposing present-day footage of overgrown rail lines with excerpts from prisoner diaries describing their construction. The open nature of the internet, however, means that this work exists alongside misinformation and politicized reinterpretations. Some online voices seek to minimize the Gulag scale, frame it as a necessary measure of the time, or dismiss survivor testimonies as exaggerated. This makes the role of credible, well-researched digital content even more critical. International collaborations have stepped in to address this, with museums, NGOs, and academic institutions pooling resources to create multilingual educational portals that include verified documents, interactive timelines, thematic essays, and teacher guides. In classrooms, digital resources have revolutionized the way the Gulag is taught. Students can now explore primary sources directly, engage in virtual field trips to memorial sites, and even participate in live Q&A sessions with historians or surviving witnesses via video link. For descendants, digital archives offer not just historical knowledge, but emotional closure, finding a name in a deportation list, seeing a scanned photograph of a relative in camp uniform, or reading their last known letter can be profoundly moving. In this way, the internet has become a new kind of memorial space, decentralized, borderless, and if preserved against censorship accessible to anyone, anywhere. Yet the digital preservation of Gulag memory faces the same fragility as physical. Archives, political pressure, cyber attacks, and the removal of online content can erase decades of painstaking work in moments. To guard against this, archivists increasingly maintain redundant backups in multiple countries, ensuring that the record survives beyond the reach of any single government's control. The digital era has not replaced the need for physical sites, survivor testimonies, or traditional archives, but it has created a parallel, resilient network of memory that connects the remote permafrost of Siberia to the screens of students, researchers, and citizens around the world. In doing so, it carries forward the same essential truth that animated the diaries, poems, and whispered stories of the camps themselves, that as long as the record exists, however fragile, the people it remembers have not been silenced. The legacy of the Gulag has not remained confined to the pages of history books or the walls of museums. It has entered the language of international politics, human rights advocacy, and the evolving frameworks of international law. In the decades since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the term Gulag itself has become a shorthand in political discourse for any system of mass incarceration, forced labor, or politically motivated imprisonment. Human rights organizations invoke it when documenting abuses in modern-day prison camps, from North Korea's Kwanlaso to China's mass detention facilities in Xinjiang, drawing explicit parallels to the mechanisms of surveillance, ideological indoctrination, and economic exploitation perfected in Stalin's time. These comparisons are not merely rhetorical. They serve as a warning that the structures enabling the Gulag unchecked executive power, opaque judicial processes, and the criminalization of dissent can emerge in different forms under different regimes. In the realm of international law, the study of the Gulag has contributed to the development of legal concepts such as crimes against humanity, enforced disappearance, and state responsibility for systemic abuses. During the post-war Nuremberg trials, Soviet prosecutors themselves participated in the prosecution of Nazi crimes while concealing the existence of their own camp. A contradiction that would later fuel debates over selective justice and the need for consistent legal standards regardless of the perpetrator. In the 1990s and early 2000s, as Eastern European nations joined the European Union and the Council of Europe, they pushed for recognition of the Gulag alongside the Holocaust in official memorialization frameworks. This effort culminated in documents such as the 2009 Prague Declaration on European Conscience and Communism, which called for equal condemnation of Nazi and communist crimes and the integration of that history into collective European memory. Globally, the Gulag has become a reference point in United Nations forums, particularly in discussions on the prevention of mass atrocities. Special rapporteurs on human rights have cited it when urging member states to ensure that political prisoners are granted fair trials, protected from torture, and not subjected to forced labor. In transitional justice processes, such as truth commissions in post-conflict societies, the Gulag's history offers a case study in how entire populations can be subjected to repression under a facade of legality, and how dismantling such systems requires both legal accountability and cultural transformation. Advocacy groups often use Gulag history to underline the importance of transparency, independent judiciary systems, and the protection of civil liberties. Exhibitions curated for international audiences, such as those organized by the Gulag History Museum in Moscow, before political constraints limited its work, have traveled to capitals around the world, pairing survivor testimonies with present-day accounts from political prisoners elsewhere. This deliberate juxtaposition reinforces the idea that remembering the Gulag is not simply an act of honoring the dead, it is a call to action in the present. Politically, the invocation of the Gulag can be both a tool and a weapon. Some governments use it to condemn rivals, casting opponents' prison systems as modern gulags to score diplomatic points. Others reject the term entirely, seeing it as a politically charged accusation meant to delegitimize their rule. This dynamic has made the Gulag a contested symbol on the world stage, one whose meaning shifts depending on who is speaking and to whom. For scholars and human rights advocates, the challenge is to keep the term anchored in historical accuracy, while making its moral lessons relevant to contemporary abuses. Educational initiatives backed by the OSCE, UNESCO, and various NGOs have sought to incorporate Gulag history into human rights training for diplomats, law enforcement, and military personnel. By studying the archival record of how the NKVD operated the quotas for arrests, the use of torture to extract confessions, the secrecy of trials trainees can identify early warning signs of repression in their own contexts. This linkage between past and present is crucial. The Gulag is not a frozen artifact, but a mirror in which the world can see the recurring patterns of authoritarianism. Campaigners have also drawn on the Gulag's legacy to push for reparations and recognition for survivors and their families, though such efforts have met with mixed success. In some post-Soviet states, symbolic compensation and official apologies have been issued. In others, survivors continue to be denied acknowledgement. Their experience is sidelined by nationalist narratives that prioritize military glory over the memory of repression. International human rights law still struggles with how to address historical injustices that have no living perpetrators, but whose consequences persist across generations. Here, the Gulag stands as both a precedent and a challenge, a reminder that justice delayed can easily become justice denied, and that the cost of forgetting is the quiet normalization of the same abuses in new guises. In global discourse, then, the Gulag is both history and warning, a chapter from the past that insists on being read aloud whenever and wherever power begins to imagine itself. Unaccountable. Beyond the halls of museums and the pages of official histories, the memory of the Gulag has endured in intimate, often hidden spaces, in kitchen conversations, in faded notebooks, in boxes of yellowed letters tied with string, and in the annual rituals of small towns far from any capital. For many families, especially in rural Russia, Siberia, and the former Soviet republics, the Gulag was not an abstract historical phenomenon, but a personal wound, passed down through whispered recollections at the dinner table. These were stories, told selectively, depending on who was present. A child might overhear fragments about a grandfather sent away for nothing, or an aunt who never came back from the north, without ever hearing the political details. Sometimes the silences were louder than the words questions met with a change of subject, or the quiet scraping of a chair as an elder left the room. In some homes, old diaries or memoirs were hidden in cupboards, written in cramped handwriting that betrayed the urgency and secrecy of their creation. These writings, often composed during exile or after release, recorded the day-to-day struggles of survival, the cold that gnawed through thin boots, the gnawing hunger that made tree bark seem edible, the camaraderie forged over shared scraps of bread. They also contained the inner landscapes of prisoners, dreams of returning home, the fear of forgetting a loved one's face, the stubborn will to keep living. In other cases, the legacy survived in objects rather than words. A hand-carved spoon made in a camp workshop, a scarf knitted from frayed uniform threads, a photograph taken in the brief moment between arrest and transport. These artifacts became family relics, passed from one generation to the next as proof of endurance. In small towns, particularly those near former campsites, local memory took on communal forms. Annual memorial services, sometimes religious, sometimes secular, were held to honor the dead. In villages where a significant portion of the population had been deported in the 1930s and 1940s, these gatherings became both acts of mourning and assertions of identity. People would read aloud the names of relatives, light candles by improvised monuments, or lay flowers at the edges of unmarked graves. Some communities erected modest memorials themselves. A simple cross by a forest road, a stone inscribed with names, or a plaque affixed to the wall of a school. These grassroots commemorations often existed alongside or in defiance of official narratives. During the Soviet period, when public acknowledgement of the Gulag was dangerous, such acts of remembrance were conducted quietly, sometimes disguised as unrelated events. A gathering for cultural heritage might include a song known to have been sung in the camps. A family picnic in the forest might in fact be a visit to a site where remains had been found. After the fall of the Soviet Union, some of these local traditions became more open, with historical societies and school programs incorporating them into public life. In other cases, especially as political repression has tightened again in recent years, they have retreated back into the private sphere. Oral history projects have sought to capture these local memories before they vanish. Volunteers travel to remote villages, recording interviews with elderly residents who remember the deportations and the return of survivors. These interviews reveal details often absent from official archives. The way neighbors reacted when NKVD trucks arrived in the night, the barter networks that sustained families left behind, the songs that prisoners sang when they returned home. Such testimonies enrich the historical record, not only by adding personal detail, but by showing how the Gulag was experienced outside the camp fences, in the streets, homes, and fields of ordinary people. For many, preserving this memory is not only about honoring the past, but about resisting the erasure of inconvenient truths. In a time when public discussion of state crimes is again restricted, the role of these private and local acts of remembrance becomes even more vital. They serve as a parallel archive, one that cannot be entirely shut down because it lives in the minds, hands, and rituals of ordinary citizens. In this way, the Gulag persists not only as a subject of academic study or political debate, but as a living, evolving presence in the everyday culture of those who still feel its shadow. It is in the quiet recitation of a name, the careful unfolding of a letter, the lighting of a candle on a winter night, that the memory of the Gulag continues to resist oblivion, sustained by those who inherit it not through books, but through blood. For many Gulag survivors, release from the camps was not the end of their sentence, but the beginning of another kind of imprisonment, one without barbed wire, but defined by silence, stigma, and the lingering wounds of trauma. Returning home, if home still existed, often meant confronting the reality that years or decades had passed, families had scattered or died, and the world they remembered no longer resembled the one before their arrest. In countless cases, survivors found their old jobs gone, their property confiscated, and their reputations irreparably stained by the label of enemy of the people. Even after official rehabilitation, the social mark remained. Neighbors avoided eye contact. Old friends hesitated to speak openly, and employment opportunities were scarce. For some, this isolation drove them into self-imposed solitude. For others, it became a catalyst to seek out fellow survivors, forming informal networks where they could speak freely about what they had endured. Psychologically, the burden was heavy. Many lived with what today would be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, plagued by recurring nightmares of interrogations, sudden noises triggering memories of camp guards, or an overwhelming sense of vigilance that never faded. Some survivors found it impossible to sleep in heated rooms, having grown used to the cold. Others hoarded bread or food scraps, unable to shake the fear of starvation. This trauma was often passed down to their children, not always through direct storytelling, but through behavior and unspoken rules. Don't attract attention. Don't speak politics in public. Don't trust authority. These second and even third generations carried what psychologists now call intergenerational trauma, manifesting in anxiety, distrust, and a complex relationship with their national identity. For those who chose to tell their stories, the act could be both cathartic and painful. Memoirs published in the post-Soviet era sometimes sold widely, giving survivors a public platform, yet even this recognition could reopen old wounds. Process of writing or speaking publicly forced them to relive moments of humiliation, violence, and lost memories they had spent years trying to contain. Others refused to share their experiences at all, fearing the return of repression or believing that no one could truly understand. The search for justice was equally complex. While some post-Soviet governments issued official apologies and offered modest financial compensation, these gestures often felt inadequate. Court cases brought by survivors or their families to reclaim property or secure pension rights were frequently bogged down in bureaucracy. And in many cases, judges ruled that too much time had passed for claims to be valid. The lack of accountability for perpetrators, many of whom died without facing trial, left a deep sense of unfinished justice. In some regions, former camp guards continued to live alongside their former prisoners, an unspoken tension that could last for decades. Yet amid the scars, there were also stories of resilience. Some survivors channeled their experiences into art, literature, or activism. They spoke in schools, helped establish memorials, or worked with NGOs to document human rights abuses in the present day, using their past as a warning. For them, survival was not just about having lived through the camps, but about shaping the meaning of that survival in a way that could serve others. In private life, healing often came in small, unremarkable moments. Planting a garden after years of forced labor in frozen soil, holding a grandchild and knowing the family line had endured, or sitting in a kitchen with friends who understood without explanation. For their descendants, grappling with this legacy meant navigating a dual inheritance, the pride of endurance and the grief of injustice. Some embraced the role of custodians of memory, preserving letters, photographs, and recorded testimonies. Others sought to break away entirely, moving abroad or choosing silence. In all cases, the Gulag's imprint remained a subtle, sometimes invisible influence on relationships, ambitions, and the willingness to trust. The struggle to find meaning after such a rupture in life was not a single moment of revelation, but an ongoing negotiation with the past. For some, faith provided a framework. For others, the pursuit of truth and the fight against repression became their guiding purpose. And for many, the quiet act of living, raising children, creating art, keeping traditions alive, was itself the final defiance against the system that had sought to erase them. In the decades since the last Gulag camps closed, a new generation has emerged that did not live through the arrests, interrogations, and forced labor, yet finds itself drawn to the legacy of those years, sometimes through family stories, sometimes through school lessons, and often through the cultural echo of injustice that resonates across time. For these young people, the Gulag is not simply a historical event. It is a living metaphor for state power gone unchecked, a warning that history can repeat when vigilance fades. Many discover its reality through art before they encounter it in textbooks. A haunting film scene of prisoners trudging through snow, under armed guard, a hip-hop track sampling a survivor's testimony, a mural painted on a cracked brick wall showing a single figure behind barbed wire, staring outward with unbroken eyes. In urban centers like Moscow, St. Petersburg, Kyiv, and Riga, student-led art collectives have organized exhibitions where paintings, installations, and interactive media invite visitors to step into reconstructed camp barracks, listen to audio, diaries, or touch artifacts while hearing the stories attached to them. These projects are not dry history. They are immersive experiences designed to provoke empathy and self-reflection. In music, a subtle movement has emerged that blends folk melodies once sung in exile with contemporary genres like indie rock and electronic ambient. Some bands write entire concept albums based on camp poetry or letters smuggled home, weaving archival text into lyrics to keep the voices of prisoners present in the cultural soundscape. Filmmakers, too, have taken up the task. While official channels may avoid politically sensitive material, independent directors release documentaries and dramas online, telling stories not only of suffering, but of small acts of humanity. A shared cigarette in a snowstorm, the sound of a remembered lullaby, a guard who turned away at the right moment. On social media, digital activism plays a major role. Young historians and citizen researchers share scanned NKVD arrest records, satellite images of former campsites now overgrown by forest, and side-by-side comparisons of archival photographs with their modern-day locations. Hashtags dedicated to remembering the Gulag trend periodically, often around key anniversaries, like the Day of Remembrance for the victims of political repression on October 30th. Short videos on platforms like TikTok and Instagram Reels condense complex historical facts into engaging narratives, pairing them with visuals and music that appeal to audiences with short attention spans. Some of these videos are explicitly political, drawing parallels between the Gulag and modern detention centers or authoritarian crackdowns. Others focus on personalizing the history by telling the life story of a single prisoner in under a minute. The reach of these efforts extends beyond national borders, connecting young Russians, Ukrainians, Latvians, and others from former Soviet republics with peers around the world who see in the Gulag's history a universal lesson about resilience, freedom, and the fragility of human rights. Educational technology has amplified this engagement. Interactive apps and virtual reality reconstructions allow users to walk through recreated camp environments, open virtual jars of prisoner files, or follow a day in the life of an inmate, from reveille to lights out. These tools are often created by small teams of programmers, designers, and historians working without state funding, relying on crowdfunding and volunteer labor to bring their visions to life. For the young creators, such work is more than a history project. It is a form of resistance against enforced amnesia. They understand that forgetting the Gulag makes it easier for similar systems to emerge, and so they use every platform available to keep the memory vivid. In some ways, their work is bolder than that of previous generations, unbound by the fear that haunted their parents and grandparents. Yet it is also more precarious, as increasing censorship and political pressure in certain countries threaten the open exchange of such stories. This tension between the freedom to remember and the forces that would prefer forgetting gives their art and activism a sense of urgency. In this, they mirror the prisoners they commemorate, working with limited resources, improvising under constraint, yet finding ways to speak. The Gulag's legacy, carried forward by these young voices, is thus not static but evolving, filtered through the aesthetics, technologies, and languages of the present, yet rooted in the same moral imperative that sustains survivors: to bear witness and to make that witness matter. Across the vast reaches of Russia and the former Soviet Union, the physical traces of the Gulag linger like ghostly scars on the landscape, often hidden in plain sight, sometimes swallowed entirely by the patient reclamation of nature. Travel deep into Siberia or to the remote reaches of the far north, and you may come upon the remains of a camp, collapsed barracks leaning drunkenly in the snow, rusted stovepipes jutting from the earth like the bones of an ancient creature, fragments of barbed wire tangled in lichen-covered stumps. In some places, the wooden watchtowers still stand, their ladder rungs rotting, the platform open to the wind, a silent witness to decades of suffering. Along forgotten railway spurs, the iron tracks may end abruptly in a field or forest, a rusted locomotive slowly sinking into moss. These were once the lifelines of the camp system, bringing in prisoners, supplies, and taking out the timber, ore, or stone wrestled from the earth by forced labor. Now they serve no purpose but to invite the imagination to retrace their original use. Nature, over time, has been the great eraser and restorer. Birch and pine grow through the foundations of barracks. Wildflowers blanket the outlines of old parade grounds, and the howling of wolves replaces the shouts of guards. In some regions, permafrost has preserved artifacts with startling clarity: boots, tools, scraps of clothing lying just beneath the surface. In others, the thaw and the years have erased nearly everything, leaving only the memory carried by local residents or the archival maps that pinpoint where the camp once stood. Yet there is a duality to these landscapes. They are both sites of atrocity and places of extraordinary natural beauty. Tourists and trekkers who stumble upon them sometimes see only the latter, unaware of the human history beneath their feet. In recent decades, some of these places have been reclaimed as official memorials. The Perm 36 camp in the Urals stands as one of the most complete preserved Gulag sites, with reconstructed barracks, exhibitions, and guided tours. Volunteers and historians have worked to stabilize the buildings and interpret the site for visitors, even as political pressures have altered how its story is told. Elsewhere, modest markers have been erected: a cross on a hillside, a plaque affixed to a boulder, a sculpture of broken chains. These memorials, often created through grassroots efforts, are both physical anchors for remembrance and acts of defiance against forgetting. But the majority of Gulag sites remain unmarked, left to decay in the open, or buried under new settlements, mines, or logging operations. In some cases, Local residents continue to use the structures for practical purposes: barns, storage sheds, or homes, repurposing the wood and metal left behind. This reuse is pragmatic, but it also layers the present over the past in a way that can make the original history harder to see. For researchers and descendants of prisoners visiting these locations can be an emotional pilgrimage. Standing where a relative once stood, perhaps in the very spot where they labored, suffered, or died, can bring a visceral understanding that no book or film can provide. The journey is often arduous, requiring travel by boat, off-road vehicle, or on foot through dense forest or tundra. Yet for many, it is worth the effort. Some bring flowers or personal tokens to leave behind. Others collect soil to take home, a tangible connection to a place tied forever to their family story. Environmental changes are also altering these landscapes. Climate change, particularly in the Arctic and subarctic, is thawing permafrost and exposing buried remains, artifacts, and structures long thought lost. This has sparked both renewed interest in preservation and heated debates about how to handle these rediscoveries. Should they be left as they are, documented, and then allowed to return to the earth? Or should they be excavated, catalogued, and displayed to ensure the memory endures? The answer varies depending on local attitudes, resources, and political climates. In this way, the geography of the Gulag continues to evolve, shaped by the interplay of memory, neglect, and the relentless forces of nature. The land remembers, even when the living do not, and in the wind over an abandoned camp or the crunch of snow on a forgotten road, one can still sense the echo of footsteps from another time beyond the borders of the former Soviet Union. The memory of the Gulag has found a second life in archives, museums, and exhibitions that stretch across continents, ensuring that this chapter of history is not confined to the nations where it occurred, but enters the global conscience. In cities from Warsaw to Washington, from Berlin to Tokyo, curators, historians, and survivors' descendants have collaborated to create spaces where the stories of political repression, forced labor, and human endurance can be encountered by people who may never have heard the word Gulag before stepping through the door. The International Memorial Society, despite facing mounting political pressure and even forced closure of some of its offices in Russia, has worked with partner institutions abroad to digitize tens of thousands of documents, making them freely accessible online. These digital archives allow researchers in Canada, Argentina, or South Africa to explore prisoner records, camp maps, and personal letters without crossing an ocean. Museums in Europe often present the Gulag as part of a broader narrative of totalitarian repression, placing it alongside the Nazi concentration camps, the Cambodian killing fields, and other atrocities of the 20th century. This comparative approach highlights both the uniqueness of the Soviet system and the universal patterns of state violence. The use of fear to control populations, the bureaucratic machinery that dehumanizes individuals, and the small acts of resistance that sustain dignity under oppression. Traveling exhibitions have proven especially powerful. One such project, Gulag, Traces and Testimonies, has moved between universities and cultural centers across North America, featuring authentic artifacts, prisoner-made tools, embroidered handkerchiefs, carved wooden spoons, accompanied by large-scale photographs of the camps as they appear today. Visitors walk through dimly lit corridors lined with panels of survivor testimony, sometimes in the original Russian with translations. Projected above, the voices creating a haunting soundscape. In Asia, academic conferences and translation projects have brought Gulag literature to new audiences, publishing works by authors like Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Varlam Shalamov, and Evgenia Ginsburg in languages from Japanese to Korean to Hindi. These translations are more than linguistic exercises. They carry the moral weight of testimony into cultural contexts that have their own histories of political imprisonment and repression. forging connections across very different societies. Filmmakers from multiple countries have collaborated on documentaries that weave together Soviet-era footage, interviews with surviving witnesses, and drone imagery of the remote landscapes where camps once stood. Some of these films have been screened at human rights festivals, where they spark discussions not only about the past, but about present-day political prisoners around the world. In the digital age, the work of remembrance has also migrated to online platforms that transcend national boundaries. Virtual reality reconstructions allow anyone with an internet connection to enter a camp, move through reconstructed barracks, or stand in the guard tower as an avatar of a prisoner walks. Below, educational YouTube channels, podcasts, and social media accounts dedicated to Gulag history reach millions, often using the language and formats familiar to younger audiences: short clips, interactive quizzes, live Q&A sessions with historians. This global remembrance is not without its tensions. Those who had stood there described it as both comforting and suffocating, a place where every whisper of ink seemed to wait for a reader who would never come got in the last years of the harem's prominence, when the empire itself was beginning to shift and the palace was no longer the unshakable center it had once been. The chamber took on a new significance. More letters arrived than ever before, as people sensed the fragility of their positions. They wrote in hurried hands, trying to secure alliances, confess feelings, or plead for mercy before it was too late. Yet still, many of these were intercepted, added to the shelves without ever reaching their intended eyes. When the harem was finally dissolved, much of its physical beauty was dismantled or repurposed, its gardens opened to the public, its silks sold, its rooms emptied. But the chamber of unread letters remained locked. Even when officials cataloged the palace archives, they left that door unopened. Perhaps they feared what would be found inside, or perhaps they understood that the room's true value lay not in the words themselves, but in the fact that they had never been read. And so, behind the cedar door, the shelves still stand, holding centuries of sealed paper, each sheet a fragment of a life lived within the palace walls. The ink may have faded, the seals may have cracked, but the emotions pressed into those pages remain as strong as the day they were written. They are the harem's final secret, waiting in silence, untouched, unseen. A reminder that sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that never reach their ending,